I never thought silence could echo louder than music. On my wedding day, it did. The hall shimmered in gold and white candles flickering, violins tuning softly, friends whispering blessings. But there was an empty space in the front row, two chairs wrapped in ivory ribbon that no one dared to sit in. They were meant for my parents. I was 31, standing in a gown I'd chosen with trembling hands months ago, surrounded by people who loved me, yet I felt utterly alone. As I looked toward the doors, still hoping they might walk through, my mind drifted backward to the kind of childhood that taught me how to wait for love that never quite arrived. I grew up in a house where affection was conditional. My parents valued appearance over emotion, achievement over honesty. They were the kind of people who smiled in public but argued behind closed doors, who believed love had to be earned through perfection. I was their eldest daughter, the one expected to set the example, to hold the family together, to make them proud. I tried. God, I tried. But somewhere between their expectations and my exhaustion, I lost the version of myself they could love. When I met David, everything felt different. He was quiet, grounded, the kind of man who listened before he spoke. He never tried to fix me. He simply stood beside me until the pieces began to fit again. My parents called him ordinary. I called him home. They didn't approve. "You can do better," my mother said, her voice coated in the same polished pride I'd grown up fearing. My father said nothing at all, just looked at David as though he were something that had crawled in from outside. When we got engaged, my parents didn't celebrate. They offered silence, heavy, disapproving silence that followed me through every phone call, every family dinner, every attempt to bridge the widening distance. I remember one night sitting in my car after leaving their house. My mother had spent an hour listing every reason why this marriage would limit me, how I was throwing away potential reputation, comfort. I had listened quietly until something inside me cracked. "Maybe I don't want a perfect life anymore," I whispered. "Maybe I just want peace." She didn't respond. She just looked at me with pity, as though peace was a poor person's dream. In the weeks leading up to the wedding, I kept hoping she'd soften. I sent invitations. I texted reminders. I even left a voicemail saying, "I'll always want you there, Mom." She never replied. The morning of the ceremony, I sat by the window while the stylist curled my hair. Outside, the sun painted the world in light, but my heart felt dim, heavy, suspended between joy and grief. I thought about calling them one more time just to hear a voice from home, even if it was cold. But something inside me whispered, "You've done enough reaching. Let them reach back." They didn't. So I walked down the aisle with my head held high, even though every step felt like a wound opening wider. I remember seeing David at the altar, his eyes soft, his smile steady, and thinking, this is what love looks like when it's not conditional. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. And real, I decided, was enough. Still, there was a part of me that couldn't stop scanning the crowd. Every familiar face I found, my friends, my coworkers, my aunt from Oregon, made me smile for a moment, then ache again when I realized who wasn't there. When the music started, the world blurred into movement, the exchange of vows, the trembling of hands, the sound of "I do" breaking through the lump in my throat. And just as the applause filled the hall, I looked at the two empty chairs again. It hit me then, they hadn't just skipped a wedding. They had abandoned a milestone, a chapter of my life I had written without their permission. At the reception, I danced. I laughed. I smiled for pictures. I told everyone I was fine. But deep down, a quiet question followed me like a shadow. Why wasn't I enough to make them stay? Later that night, after everyone had gone, I stood alone under the string lights outside. My gown brushed against the grass. The air smelled of wine and roses. David was inside thanking the guests, but I needed a moment with the silence. I looked up at the stars and whispered to myself, they missed it. They really missed it. And then unexpectedly, I cried, not out of anger but release. Because I realized the pain wasn't about what they'd done to me. It was about what I'd allowed myself to keep hoping for. I'd built my happiness on the idea that one day they'd see me, love me, choose me. But that night, under those lights, I understood something else: I didn't need to be chosen to be complete. That realization didn't come like a burst of light. It came quietly, like dawn seeping through curtains after a long, sleepless night. The next morning, I woke to sunlight streaming across our hotel room. David was still asleep, his hand resting over mine. I turned my phone on, dozens of messages, none from them. For the first time, it didn't crush me, it freed me. Because love, I finally understood, isn't proven by who shows up for the picture. It's proven by who stays when the room is empty. The morning after the wedding felt strangely still, like the world had paused to let me breathe for the first time in years. I woke to the sound of waves brushing against the shoreline outside our window. The hotel overlooked the sea, a view David had chosen, because he said it would remind us of beginnings, not endings. I turned toward him. He was already awake, his eyes half open, his smile soft. Without saying a word, he reached for my hand, and for a brief moment, everything that had hurt fell quiet. But quiet isn't the same as healed. Even as the sun spilled across our sheets, I felt the ghost of yesterday tugging at my chest. The two empty chairs, the silence where a mother's hug should have been the echo of vows said without my family's blessing. I didn't want to ruin the moment, so I smiled back at David, whispering, "Good morning, husband." He kissed my forehead and said, "Good morning, wife." We both laughed, soft and sleepy, but somewhere inside I could feel a storm forming, not loud but certain. Later, while he showered, I scrolled through the photos our friends had sent overnight. They were beautiful, me laughing, the golden light wrapping around us, friends cheering as we danced. But then I saw one picture that made me pause. It was taken from the back of the hall, capturing the entire aisle and the two empty chairs at the front. It was such a small detail, yet it pulled me apart all over again. The photographer had captioned it "Beautiful moment, every seat filled with love." Except it wasn't, not every seat. For the first time since the ceremony, I let myself feel it all. The disappointment, the humiliation, the quiet grief that comes when the people who made you can't celebrate who you've become. I thought about my mother, how she used to fix my hair for school and say, "Always look your best. People judge what they see." And my father, who rarely spoke unless it was to correct me. Somewhere deep down, I'd spent my whole life trying to earn their nod of approval through grades, through promotions, through perfection. But no matter what I achieved, it was never quite enough. And now even marriage, something sacred, something pure, wasn't enough either. The world outside glittered with morning light, and yet I felt like I was sinking. I wrapped the hotel blanket around myself and stepped onto the balcony. The air smelled of salt and jasmine. The ocean stretched endlessly, the same blue I used to dream about when I was younger. A world that felt wide and kind and far away from judgment. David joined me, coffee in hand. He didn't speak, just leaned against the railing beside me. Sometimes silence from the right person feels like a language of its own. After a while, he asked softly, "You're thinking about them, aren't you?" I nodded. I thought maybe they'd change their mind at the last minute. He took my hand. "You gave them every chance. They chose absence. That's not on you." His words hit me in a place I'd been protecting for years. I wanted to believe him, but the child inside me, the little girl who waited at school long after everyone else had been picked up, couldn't help whispering, "But maybe I just wasn't worth the drive." That day we didn't do much. We walked along the beach barefoot, ate breakfast late, watched seagulls dive into the waves, but the ache followed quietly behind us, the way grief does, not demanding attention, but never letting go. That night, I wrote my parents an email. Not to accuse them, not to beg for answers, just to tell them the truth. "Yesterday was the most beautiful day of my life," I wrote. "But I wish you could have seen it. I wish you could have seen how happy I was, how loved I am. I wanted you there not for validation, but because I still believed that somewhere inside you loved me too." I paused, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. Then I added one more line, "But I understand now. You love the version of me that fits your world, not the one who built her own." When I hit send, I didn't expect a reply. Days passed. The honeymoon came and went, full of laughter, travel, quiet nights, and healing. But the reply never came. One morning, as I unpacked our suitcases back home, I saw a small silver box on my nightstand, a wedding gift I hadn't noticed before. It was from my aunt, my mother's older sister. Inside was a note in her looping handwriting. "I'm sorry they couldn't come. They'll never admit it, but it's pride. They don't know how to love you outside their expectations. But you, my dear, learned something they never did, that love built from freedom lasts longer than love built from fear." I read it 3 times before I realized I was crying. It wasn't sadness this time, it was recognition. Someone had finally seen the truth of it. In the weeks that followed, life settled into something gentle. David and I built routines, morning walks, shared meals, laughter over burnt toast. My world grew smaller but warmer, and yet sometimes, when the house was quiet and the light hit the walls just right, I'd still imagine them, my parents sitting in their silent home, pretending my wedding had never happened. It didn't make me angry anymore. It just made me sad for them, for how fear can shrink a heart until it mistakes love for control. Then one evening, as the sun dipped behind the trees, my phone buzzed. A message from my mother. My breath caught. It was short, only 3 words. Hope you're well. No mention of the wedding. No apology. Just a polite, distant message that said everything and nothing. I stared at it for a long time. My first instinct was to reply, I am. I really am. But something stopped me, because I realized I didn't owe her an update anymore. My happiness no longer needed her acknowledgement to exist. So instead, I put the phone down, walked into the kitchen, and helped David finish cooking dinner. The scent of garlic and butter filled the air, the kind of ordinary comfort that once would have felt too small. But that night, it felt like everything I'd ever wanted. And for the first time in my life, I didn't feel like the daughter they had lost. I felt like the woman I had found. A few days later, the world began to move again slowly, like a clock that had stopped ticking and finally found its rhythm. David went back to work, and I started sorting through the leftover wedding boxes. Flowers, photos, thank you cards, each one a reminder of the day I had dreamed of since I was a little girl. But dreams are strange things. Sometimes they come true, and still you feel the ache of what's missing. I sat on the floor, surrounded by ribbons and photographs, running my fingers along the edge of an envelope addressed to my parents. I had written their names in perfect cursive, thinking they would be sitting in the front row. I had imagined my father's proud smile, my mother's tears. Instead, the envelope had been returned unopened with a tiny red stamp that read, "Undeliverable." It wasn't just a piece of mail. It was proof. Proof that no matter how much I reached toward them, they'd closed every door. That night, I found myself replaying the last conversation I'd had with my mother before everything fell apart. It was 2 weeks before the wedding. She had come over to talk sense into me. I made tea. She didn't touch it. She sat on my couch, perfect posture, perfect composure, the kind of elegance that always made me feel small. She said, "You're choosing a smaller life, Allison. You could have had more." And I said, "I don't want more. I just want real." Her silence after that was louder than any argument. When she left, I stood at the window watching her car drive away, knowing it wasn't just distance, it was goodbye. But even now, months after the wedding, I still caught myself looking at my phone, sometimes expecting her name to appear. The human heart, I've learned, doesn't heal linearly. It moves like the tide, forward then back, carrying memories you thought you'd released. I remember one night I couldn't sleep. I went into the kitchen and found David sitting there working on his laptop. The soft glow of the screen lit his face, and for a moment I just stood in the doorway watching him, this man who had chosen me without hesitation when the people who raised me couldn't. He looked up and smiled. "Can't sleep?" I shook my head, just thinking. He gestured to the chair next to him. "Then think out loud. Sometimes it helps." I sat down, folding my hands in my lap. "Do you ever feel like you're mourning people who are still alive?" He nodded slowly, closing the laptop. "All the time. It's the kind of grief that never gets a funeral." I looked at him, and for the first time, someone had put words to what I'd been carrying. My family wasn't gone, but the version of them I loved no longer existed. I was mourning an illusion, the idea that love by itself could change people. The next day, I started writing again, something I hadn't done since I was a teenager. I opened an old notebook and began with one sentence. "I thought love was what you gave people to make them stay. But sometimes love is what you give yourself to finally let them go." The words flowed like water after that. I wrote about childhood, about pressure, about being the good daughter who never felt good enough. I wrote until the page blurred. It wasn't for anyone else. It was for me. Weeks turned into months. The sharp pain softened into something quieter, something I could live with. And then, one ordinary afternoon, something unexpected happened. A letter arrived in the mail, handwritten, familiar. My mother's cursive. For a long time I couldn't open it. I just stared at the envelope, afraid of what it might say. When I finally tore it open, the paper trembled in my hands. Allison. It began. I saw the wedding photos online. You looked beautiful. I'm sorry I wasn't there. Your father and we thought we were protecting you from a mistake, but maybe we were protecting ourselves from seeing how much we'd already lost. My hands froze over the page, the words blurred through tears. I don't know how to fix this, she continued, but I want to try if you'll let me. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. The letter wasn't perfect. It wasn't an apology that undid the years of silence, but it was something. A crack of light in a wall I thought would never break. That evening I showed it to David. He read it quietly, then looked at me and asked, "What do you want to do?" I didn't answer right away. I looked out the window. The sky bruised with sunset, the world still and golden. "I want to forgive her," I finally said, "but not for her peace, for mine." The next morning I wrote back, "Mom, thank you for writing. I've spent so long wishing things could be different. Maybe they still can, not the way they were, but something new. I'm willing to talk. But please understand, I'm no longer the girl who needs your approval. I just want honesty." I sealed the letter and sent it off without expectation. Weeks passed. Life moved quietly. Work dinners, laughter, small joys that stitched the days together. Then one morning, as I was watering the plants on our balcony, my phone buzzed. A message from her. "Lunch next week, just you and me." My hands shook, but I smiled. The restaurant she chose was one she'd always loved, elegant, expensive, all marble and mirrors. As I walked in, I saw her at a corner table clutching a small clutch bag like it was armor. She looked older, softer maybe. When her eyes met mine, there was something unfamiliar there, vulnerability. She stood awkwardly, and for a moment neither of us knew what to do. Then I reached out first. "Hi, Mom." Her voice trembled. "Hi, sweetheart." We sat. The conversation began with small things, the food, the weather work. But eventually it shifted. She told me she'd seen the photos, that I looked happy, that she'd been wrong. And then she said the words I never thought I'd hear. "I didn't come because I didn't know how to face the daughter I couldn't control anymore. You grew into your own person, and that scared me." There it was, the truth, fragile, raw, but real. I listened quietly. For the first time in my life, I wasn't seeking her approval. I was offering her grace. I reached across the table, my hand covering hers. "I still love you, Mom. But I need you to see me as I am, not as who you wanted me to be." Her lips quivered. She nodded. "I'm trying." And somehow that was enough. When we left the restaurant, she hugged me. Not the stiff, polite embrace of before, but a real one, the kind where you can feel someone's heart finally unclench. As I drove home that evening, the city lights blurred through my tears. It wasn't a fairy tale reconciliation, but it was a beginning. I realized something then. Forgiveness isn't a gift you give someone else. It's a bridge you build for yourself so you can finally stop standing on the ruins. A week after that lunch, I still felt the ghost of my mother's hug on my shoulders, light, but real. The kind of warmth you almost don't trust at first. Every few days, she'd text something small. "How are you sleeping?" Or "I made that soup you used to love." They were fragments of normalcy, tiny threads trying to stitch back a bond that had been torn for years. I didn't rush to reply every time. I wanted to let her words breathe, to make sure this new version of her wasn't just guilt wearing softer clothes. But slowly something inside me softened too. Maybe time really does dull the sharp edges, not by erasing them, but by teaching you how to live around them. One evening, as David and I sat on the couch, he handed me his phone. "You should see this," he said with a small smile. It was an article from a local blog, "The Power of Forgiveness, A Daughter's Story." It wasn't about me directly, but the story felt eerily close. A woman who had spent years estranged from her family, only to realize that healing wasn't about reopening old wounds, it was about not letting them define her anymore. I looked at David and smiled. "You sent this on purpose." He shrugged. "Maybe the universe sent it to me first." Later that night, as I brushed my hair before bed, I caught my reflection in the mirror. For years I had looked at myself and seen someone incomplete, someone missing a piece only her family could fill. But that night I saw something else. I saw a woman who had built herself back from silence, from rejection, from a love that was never quite given freely. My phone buzzed again, a message from my father this time. "Your mother told me about lunch. I'm glad you two talked. Maybe we can all meet soon." The words sat heavy in my hands. I hadn't spoken to him directly since before the wedding. The last thing he'd said to me was, "You'll regret this someday." But regret never came, peace did. I showed the text to David, who just said gently, "You'll know when you're ready." I didn't answer that night. I needed time to remember who I was before I walked back into the world that once broke me. Days passed. I focused on work on our home, on the small rhythms of ordinary life. Each morning the sunlight spilled through our kitchen window, catching on the mugs we'd collected from our travels. David would hum softly as he made coffee, and I'd think this is family too. Because family, I realized, isn't only about who raised you. It's also about who stands beside you when you're rebuilding. A few weeks later, I finally agreed to meet my father. He wanted to visit our house, something he'd never done before. I cleaned every surface, not because I wanted to impress him, but because I wanted the space to feel like mine, untainted by the past. When he arrived, he stood at the doorway, hesitant, his usual authority replaced by something quieter, almost fragile. He looked around the living room, his eyes landing on the wedding photo hanging above the fireplace. He stared at it for a long time. Then he said, almost under his breath, "You look happy." I nodded, "I am." He walked to the window, his hands behind his back. "You know," he began slowly, "your mother and we didn't mean to hurt you, we just thought we knew better." I swallowed. But knowing better doesn't always mean loving better. He turned toward me, and for the first time in my life, I saw tears in his eyes. "You're right," he said simply. We stood there in silence, the air between us filled with all the words that had gone unsaid for years. Finally, he whispered, "I'm proud of you, Allison." It was strange hearing it now after all this time. The words didn't feel like validation, they felt like closure. I didn't need them to feel whole, but they landed gently like a soft rain after a long drought. David came in from the kitchen then, offering coffee. My father accepted it, his hands shaking slightly as he took the cup. For a moment, the three of us stood together, not as broken pieces of a family, but as people learning how to coexist with the past. That evening after they left, I sat on the porch watching the last light fade. The air was cool, the kind of quiet that hums with peace instead of pain. I realized that something had shifted, not in them, but in me. Forgiveness hadn't changed what they did. It hadn't erased the years of absence or the ache of those 2 empty chairs at my wedding. But it had changed me. It had loosened the knot of resentment that had lived in my chest for so long. Sometimes love isn't about returning to what was. It's about recognizing that the version of you that survived the one who carried herself through every heartbreak deserves gentleness too. I picked up my journal and wrote a single line. Healing doesn't always mean reconciliation. Sometimes it just means the pain finally has somewhere soft to land. In the following weeks, my relationship with my parents found a rhythm, fragile but functional. They'd call on Sundays. My mother would ask about recipes. My father would send photos of the garden he was finally tending again. We didn't talk about the past much. We didn't need to. The silence between us had changed. It wasn't heavy anymore. It was cautious but kind. And one morning as I was leaving for work, I caught my reflection again, this time in the glass of the front door. I saw a woman who had walked through fire and come out not untouched but unburned. A woman who had chosen peace over pride. Later that night, David and I hosted a small dinner for our friends. Laughter filled the house, real, effortless, alive. As I watched everyone around the table, I thought back to that empty space at my wedding. For years, I'd focused on who wasn't there. But that night, I finally saw who was. The ones who stayed, the ones who loved without conditions, the ones who made family mean something different, something better. And as I looked across the table at David, our hands brushing, I whispered to myself, "I'm finally home." A year passed before I realized just how much had changed. Not in one grand cinematic moment, but in the quiet rhythm of ordinary days that no longer hurt to live. The scars from the past didn't fade, they simply stopped bleeding. It was a Sunday morning when I found myself back in the same church where I'd gotten married. David and I had been invited to a friend's wedding, and as I walked through the doors, the faint scent of lilies and polished wood flooded me with memories. The sunlight fell through the stained glass in the same patterns, painting the pews in gold and crimson. For a second, my breath caught. I saw that image again, 2 empty chairs wrapped in ivory ribbon. I thought I'd buried that memory for good, but it surfaced gently without the sting it once carried. This time it didn't hurt, it just reminded me how far I'd come. As the ceremony began, I reached for David's hand. He squeezed mine softly, his thumb tracing slow circles across my skin. When the bride appeared radiant and trembling, I felt tears slip down my cheek. But they weren't for her. They were for me, for the woman I used to be standing in that same aisle, hoping love could fill the spaces family had left empty. After the wedding, my mother texted me, "Saw photos of you there. You look beautiful. Maybe next time we can all go together." I stared at the message for a long time before replying, "Maybe we can." There was no bitterness, no sarcasm, just quiet truth. I wasn't that hurt daughter anymore. I was someone new, someone who could hold both pain and peace without letting either define her. That night back home, I took out a box I hadn't opened in months, the one that held all the remnants of my wedding. The invitations, the ribbon, the vows I'd written by hand. On top of everything, still wrapped neatly, were those two name cards, Mom and Dad. For a moment, I held them, tracing the letters with my thumb. Then I placed them gently inside a new envelope, sealed it, and wrote on the front. They didn't come, but I did. I put the envelope away, not out of anger, but closure. Because that story no longer belonged to pain, it belonged to the woman who survived it. Later that evening, as the sky turned dark and the crickets began their quiet chorus, I walked outside with David. The air was cool, touched by the promise of rain. The world felt wide and forgiving, the kind of peace that doesn't need to be earned anymore. We sat on the porch, wrapped in a blanket, watching the horizon fade. I leaned my head against his shoulder and said softly, "Do you ever think about how everything had to break before it could fit together?" He smiled. "I think that's how light gets in." I closed my eyes. For the first time in years, I believed him completely. Because I'd learned that heartbreak doesn't end you, it refines you. It scrapes away every layer of expectation, pride, and need for validation until only truth remains. And truth, no matter how painful, is the foundation where freedom grows. Months later, on our first anniversary, my mother sent a gift, a framed photograph. It was one I'd never seen, taken by a distant relative who had attended the wedding. In the photo, David and I were standing under the lights, laughing, heads tilted toward each other, as if the rest of the world didn't exist. On the back, she'd written, "We should have been there, but I'm grateful you didn't wait for us to live your joy." I cried, not out of sorrow, but gratitude. Because finally my mother understood what I had learned the hard way. Love doesn't always come when you need it, but sometimes it finds its way back once you've stopped chasing it. I hung the photo in our hallway, not as a reminder of what I'd lost, but of what I'd gained, the strength to love myself, even when others couldn't. And whenever I walked past it, I whispered a quiet prayer for the girl I used to be. You waited. You hoped. You hurt. And still you rose. Because I did rise. Not in defiance, not in revenge, but in grace. My story isn't about the absence of family anymore. It's about the discovery of self, the reclamation of joy, and the kind of healing that doesn't announce itself but changes everything quietly from the inside out. Now, when people ask about my parents, whether we've reconciled, whether things are back to normal, I smile and say, we're learning how to love each other differently. And that's enough. In the end, I've realized that life doesn't give you perfect families or flawless love stories. It gives you broken pieces and the courage to make something beautiful out of them. So I wake up each day, look at the man beside me, and choose love again. Not the kind that demands proof, but the kind that stays. The kind that feels like home. And whenever I think about that wedding day, about the two empty chairs and the ache they left behind, I smile. Because now I understand those empty seats weren't a symbol of loss. They were space for forgiveness, for growth, for the life I would one day step into. They didn't show up, but I did, and that was enough. If this story touched your heart, please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe. Because somewhere out there, someone is still waiting for the love they deserve, and your share might be the light that reminds them it's coming. Thank you for listening.